welcome back to another Words That Kill. And in this episode, we are discussing the mob mentality death. And our guest is the talented author S.M. Hillman, also known as Sean. And I'm going to let him introduce himself, so take it away.
Thank you so much. Yep, I'm SM Hillman professionally, or just Sean. You can find most of the things at thewickedvoice.com. And I'm also occasionally a host for This Week in Indies here on the Go Indie Network. And as well as a couple of the role-playing shows, Zero Means You're Dead, and Hit the Dice, where we have actual play.
Okay, so death of a character by the mob crosses a lot of genres. It's in westerns, it's an outlaw lynching. There's castle storming in fantasy and gothic horror, riots in political thrillers or dystopian novels, and even getting killed by the zombie horde might be considered a mob mentality death. So, what do you think is the fundamental attraction it holds for writers and readers?
As a reader, I love it when a character gets a kind of comeuppance. That's always satisfying, and especially if it's done well. As a writer, I think it's the same kind of thing where you can take the reader along this journey to where either they're extremely sympathetic that this person is about to get got, or they're extremely satisfied that this person has got to get got, and that sort of mob closing in on the character can be a really thrilling scene to write. So even if one of the characters is someone the reader doesn't want to die.
Okay, so which genre do you think it works best with this mob mentality idea, and or can it work equally as well across multiple genres?
So I think that to talk about zombies just very briefly, one of the things I don't like about a zombie book or is if too many of the point of view characters or the characters that you're familiar with are dying, because if they all sort of die from the mob, I think it lessens somewhat the death. But I do think it works well for that specific genre. I mean, a horde of skeletons is a little less impressive or scary than a horde of zombies, I think, because the zombie is so, because everything wrapped up in that. So horror, I think, works pretty well for what we would consider to be extreme political commentary or stories where that sort of political violence, I think it works pretty well with that as well. While I love things like the 40K universe where there are hordes of bad guys, I don't think it necessarily works quite as well in a genre like that because you're constantly inundated by the mob and it's not particularly special. It can be very much expected, right? The Xenos are going to break into your fortress and they're going to eat everybody. I guess fantasy too, depending on how the Death of Boromir, I think is one of those things, both visually. Well, better. It's better. I'd go back and forth on this, but I think it actually did work better on screen than necessarily in the book. But something like that, I think it could be very effective as well.
Okay, so have you ever written a death by mob scene? And if not, would you do it in the future?
I have not published a death by mob scene yet. It's in one of my work in progresses, wrapped up in themes of cannibalism, mob mentality, but sort of that cultish, that sort of cultish mentality. So yeah, absolutely. I've written a few here and there for different projects I've worked on, and try to, it's something that I didn't really think a lot about until I tried to write it, and I was like, okay, wait, this is not as easy as I thought it would be. So for sure, I would absolutely write more.
Okay, so what do you think are the good and bad points of this trope? Has it become cliche, or is it by nature something that will always resonate with readers?
I think it will always resonate with the readers as long as the writer is able to execute it well. Because most stories are kind of set pieces. You usually will have one character talking to another character, doing something with another character. There may be more people involved, but really the focus sticks to a couple characters. And having this sort of mob, whether it be 12 people, whether it be 1,000 people, or 1,000 whatever, I don't think that would ever get old because I think it is both frightening for the characters that we don't want to lose and it's very tense. I always get very tense when I realize that's coming and it's a character that I would like to survive. It's like, nope, you're not going to make it. Sorry. Um, and for writing, that villain's last stand, as it were, when they get their final coup de main, I think that's very satisfying to write. So it's very satisfying to read. So I don't think it will ever be cliche, because I don't think that we see it or read it that often. At least I don't.
Okay, so how would you approach writing a mob death scene from the point of view of the victim?
I think that that really depends on the character. So first, if we're establishing a character, who are they? Are they completely innocent and they're about to be, mobbed? Very tragic. I think that you would need to work their emotions into it. I think it's a bit bigger impact if you're writing it from their point of view. If the person is sort of like someone who's what we might consider those characters who maybe are both a little bit hero, both villainous, someone who's did a little bit of bad things or is cowardly, maybe. Again, I think establishing their feelings about how do they have regrets about their actions now that the end is near. And I think too, finally, with someone who would be very villainous, I think that deep in their thoughts, are they um, pragmatic? It's like, well, this is the game I played and I lost, or do they maintain that this is not fair, right? That concept, this isn't fair. I shouldn't be dying like this to the very end. Um, and then I think too, what kind of impact you want on the reader is how vicious the death is. Like you can cut away from someone being shot down or stabbed or eaten, uh, or you can really kind of focus in on that those last moments, right? And I think it's important too where you cut. Do you fade to black, to their last conscious moments, or do you cut before that? I think that is a decision you have to make when you're getting into that kind of death.
Okay, so, and conversely, how would you approach writing a death scene from the point of view of someone caught up in the mob mentality?
That's a great question. So we're excluding any kind of mob that has either no control over what they're doing, or they're dead and undead and they're not really thinking. Someone caught up in a mob, I think you have to really decide how they're approaching this. Is this because a lot of people get, when they're in a group, they get group courage. It's like, yeah, we're going to make changes and we're gonna get this person, and right up until the moment where they actually have to commit the violence. Um, and I think of that moment is kind of where I would focus. I tend to focus on those kind of things. So I'd focus on that moment of violence where they're they're going from that comfort of the group to does that extend into the actual violence, or do they suddenly become an individual again as they're participating in the death of this character? That's kind of where I would focus most of my attention.
Okay, so what are the emotional essentials of writing this type of death scene?
I think that again, it depends on who's dying. You either have to create a sense of tragedy if it's someone, either a tragic hero or someone who's completely innocent, and I think it needs to be a sense of satisfaction. Um, in a lot of ways, you can subvert the death. Zombies, again, for instance, the zombies attack and they chew on the person, and then they die and they become a zombie. So in some way, they come back, right? They're still around. I think there needs to be a sense of finality about it, and I think that you need to lead up to, it's all the death of a character is all about what's happened before, and you need to create the kind of on ramp for the reader to be able to react in the way that you want them to react. So finding the emotional core of that death, and then making sure that it makes sense along the way, right up until the moment where they finished off.
So how would you handle the fear factor um, in that emotional impact?
Some depends on point of view, right? If it's first person, I think that there has to be some internal monologue as well as physical. Maybe they're trembling, they can't feel their fingers, um, they want to cry but they can't. So there needs to be some sort of physical manifestation, regardless, and as well as that inner monologue, those fears, or even in a vocal monologue, right? Them yelling at the mob, saying, "You can't do this to me. Don't do this. Please don't do this." Um, if it's a point of view where you're somewhat detached from the character's inner monologue, I think it really you need to focus on the physical. What even it's the mob themselves. What are they seeing? Person trembling. Um, have they soiled themselves? Are they running? Are they fighting back? Are they trying to just escape? Like escape? That the physicality can convey the emotion of fear. Um, and in some cases, maybe even the lack of like a subtle kind of fear is good too. Maybe the person right up until the last minute is very practical, and then they have that last moment of, oh no, there's nothing I can do now to escape, which I think is a different kind of fear than someone who's been afraid the whole time.
Interesting. So, what would you consider effective ways to show lasting ramifications for this type of character death on the mob?
If we're talking politics, I think the the French Revolution is a great sort of model where once they cross the line, right, they kill the king, they kill Marie Antoinette, which is very tragic in my opinion, and they're lopping off heads left and right, but they turn on each other pretty quickly, and they turn on some of the real, Robespierre turns on Danton pretty badly, and I think that in that context, it's not a finality, right? The mob closes in on this person and they guillotine them or whatever they're going to do, but there's no finality to it, right? And I think that's important to show is that it will feed. It's a monster that will constantly need to be fed. The mob is that, and I think obviously with zombies that's true. Is the intention of the story for the mob to disperse after a particular death, after the tension and the drama has gone away, or is this something that's going to continue on, right? A voracious alien race, with all the other connotations taken into account. They may never, one single death is they don't even necessarily register that, right? Some mobs, zombies, plants, I guess, don't necessarily even register the death. It's just for them, it's just another day. Um, and I think that's important too. Is there even an impact on the mob? Do they care? Lottery, right? The madness of the mob is structured in such a way as to, they're all very matter of fact about it. When the family's lining up to see which one of them is going to get it, they're still all the kids, the father, they're all still very cool and calm. It's like, oh, okay, haha. All right, I guess we're going to find out. And it's only at the end, that the character is like, wait, what are we doing? And everybody else is like, nope, not, the thinking is done. It's time to do the killing. So,
That's a very good example, by the way.
yeah.
How much setup do you think these death scenes require? Are they the payoff for the narrative's building tension and conflicts?
Well, not necessarily the entire narrative, it doesn't have to be, but certainly that the plot line, the plot thread that's leading from wherever they're getting to this particular character's death by mob has to be a strong one. I think that, obviously you can always do throwaway scenes, but I think it really needs to be impactful. I think it really needs to show the chaos inherent in a particular story.
Okay, so you touched a little bit on this before, but how much shock value should you use when you're writing a mob mentality death scene? Do you think it's more effective to go for the gore or to leave the details to the reader's imagination?
I think that I like the idea of the reader fully invested in the emotions of the character because that's more interesting. Not that I don't mind writing a gory scene, right? And I think that sometimes that is there needs to be a visceral, physical um, physicality. If the character in particular was very cruel, I think that showing that cruelty coming back to them in a gory, messy death is satisfying. I don't think that we should fetishize it though, right? Um, you could describe certain body parts being ripped off, and I don't necessarily think you just have to go that far. But having a leg ripped off, right? They come in and they tear him or her or their body apart. I think that could be very satisfying for the reader. So
Okay, so violent mob scenes often come with societal or political, even controversial undertones. So, what advice would you give for showing real world parallels in those scenes um, without being heavy handed about what you're doing?
I think that a lot comes from the makeup of the mob itself. You can create metaphors. So I remember in Dawn of the Dead, they're up on top, and one of the Dawn of the Deads, and the person's like, "Oh, look, it's Burt Reynolds," right when Burt was still alive. I thought that was social commentary, right? And Burt was very popular back in the day. So even the celebrities are being turned into zombies, and that kind of creates this atmosphere like nobody's immune to this. I think that if you were writing political theater, you'd want. I think the French Revolution is a great point. You could make parallels with the Committee of Public Safety and the I say irrational hatred. Not that the royal family and the estates and the nobles were nice people. They obviously were not. But the sort of irrational hatred of the mob for anyone who even dared to move away from the idea of revolution and the idea of exterminating the conservative aspects of French society at the time.
Okay, so what advice would you give for making sure your scene isn't cliched when you're dealing with a mob death scene?
I think you want to stay away from chase scenes. I feel like it always works best if the chase is relatively short or unconventional, like running down a street. I mean, I think we've seen that. Maybe a chase through a building, or the mob cutting off the exits of the building, slowly going up each flight of stairs. I think that builds tension. But I would avoid too many running down the street with the mob after you cliches. But I would try to avoid the stoicness of death, even though I mentioned earlier, characters who right at that last moment realize that they're doomed. I'm generally a pretty stoic individual, but I think I'd probably be a little bit bummed, more than a little bit bummed, if 1,000 people didn't like me and were coming to kill me. And I think that's important too, right? So less the um, stoic death, more man, this stinks. I think too heroic deaths. Someone charges a mob, for instance, to to wait for others escape. I think that's pretty cool. Um, but I think you would want to do a little research in historically last stands. What details from whatever details we can glean from history. There's still a lot of fear involved in that, right? Yes, you're doing a heroic thing, but charging down a hill at 1,000 enemies, it's you're probably not going to make it out. Um, and the thought processes for that individual, I think, would be very interesting. So to avoid kind of the cliche, I would um, focus on their vulnerability, right? Even though they're doing a heroic thing.
Yeah, charging down a hill into 1,000 people in order to stave them off isn't probably going to work either.
No, it's really not.
Because they're just going to go around you and keep going.
Yes. Typically, that is what happens. So.
Yeah, I mean, historically, I mean, I don't know all but historically, last stands have usually been in narrow spaces. Like,
Mm-hmm.
there's been several last stand sort of things happen on bridges or in narrow
Yes.
passes, like the 300 of
Right.
the. And so narrow spaces that you can easily defend are usually where you make the last stands for mobs.
Right. But hey, to avoid cliche, you
Yeah.
can charge down a hill at your enemy, I guess.
And then you actually have the last stand fail entirely.
Yes, right, exactly. Right. There's that's another great way to avoid cliche. Your noble death just is basically, sorry, you didn't really accomplish what you wanted. Which
you
is
didn't think this through.
Yeah.
Okay, and now we're at the 3 questions I ask everybody, just for fun. Do you find it easy to kill off characters, or do you struggle with it?
I don't struggle with it, because my characters, they have a purpose, a particular story, and I might be sad that when I write a scene, it's like, oh, even if someone says a villain, I really like this character, and he's going or she's going or they're going to their final resting place, and I feel like giving them their end is important. It's an important part of their narrative. So.
Okay, so what is the most creative or memorable death you've given a character?
It's a superhero story, and the character was trying to stop a rocket. I guess he get like Superman, but this individual was not Superman. So they just talking about last stands that failed. They thought they were strong enough to just ram the rocket. They found out that was not their superpower, right? And they could fly, they were strong, but they couldn't withstand running headfirst into a rocket. So they sort of splattered off the rocket, and it continued on its way. I think it's probably the most memorable in that regard.
Yeah, probably be in our top 10 list of authors' answers too. Okay, so what is the oddest or most notable thing that you've researched related to a character death?
2 things come to mind. How long a person can survive without some of their internal organs, right? And which is not very long, as we might imagine. I was always fascinated by this weird dichotomy. You basically lose consciousness unless you're really good about 2 minutes after, if you're holding your breath. And then, you start suffering brain damage at 4 minutes, or at least when I was a kid, that was the standard. But then you'd watch strangulation scene and you think, well, that wasn't 2 minutes, maybe they're out of air, and then they let them go, right? They strangle somebody and then they let them go. Like, well, is that person actually dead or not? So researching the actual mechanics of strangulation, I think, is probably one of the most weirdest things I've done. Hopefully the FBI wasn't watching at the time.
Yeah, it does take a great deal longer time to strangle someone than they show in the movies and TV shows.
Right.
Yep. No, I haven't tried it. I've just researched it like you.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Same with asphyxiation. It takes a great deal longer than they actually show. But then they have to speed things up, for time and shows like that.
Right.
So
same thing with like using chloroform in someone.
Yeah.
It's like in the show, it's like 15 seconds, or like, oh no, they're instantly asleep. But it takes a lot longer than that. So.
Yeah, the reality is often not the same as the TV show.
No.
Okay, so I think we'll wrap the episode here with that note, and I'd like to thank you for being a guest today. It was a pleasure talking with you.
Absolutely, I've had a great time.
And tell everybody where they can find you and your books.
You can find me at thewickedboys.com, and you can find me here on Goni Now. And 0 means you're dead, and hit the dice in This Week in Indies.
Okay, and that's it for this episode, and bye for now.
I want to read a selection from the middle of the story Sirocco. As a rule, Alana kept her hair short between duties, arranging and growing her hair as needed for the different people she had to play. In this case, she had come to the far shores as a customer, wearing the same medium length she had worn on the Cristolo family yacht. An hour's worth of work, and the excess hair dissolved away down to her normal, close-cropped style. Gone was the makeup, and Alana lost her charming smile. Instead of dab of cream to make her eyes look tired, she practiced making her face sag, keeping a perpetual look of exhaustion. Would suggest a worker who went through life with deadlines chasing her. Olana exited the hotel through a back door that conveniently didn't show on the boards. A quick change of outfit, and into the far shores walked an overstressed, highly trained plumber who doubled as an electrician and a programmer. Grail, the well-dressed manager from the previous day, greeted her. "Thank you for coming so quickly. We have a VIP client with a need for discretion. Can I see your security pass?" Alana handed the pass over, revealing beaten and scarred hands and fingernails that she had chewed off a few hours earlier. Always the small details, she reminded herself. Alana could tell the supervisor had been looking. Grail's sharp eyes made the mission more difficult. The manager understood the need for security and discretion. Time was of the essence for the hotel, but the supervisor checked and double-checked Alana's false credentials until the manager was satisfied. Without looking up, Grail dropped the credentials on the counter and pushed over an invoice to sign. "Sign this." Alana did as instructed, just as any of the millions of service workers on Sirocco would have. Room 19, 11th floor. The supervisor did look up long enough to scowl at Alana while handing her her work order. Alana nodded once and headed off to the elevator. A woman in a business suit was waiting at the elevator on the 11th floor. The suit had enough room for the woman to move with freedom, should the situation warrant it. Alana owned several such suits. The woman checked her credentials and communicated with a companion at the door to the suite. Alana was allowed to proceed down the hall to another checkpoint before finally getting to the door. She was scanned and checked and physically searched. The agent doubted these goons could find where she had her special tools hidden, unless they stripped her down and tore apart her clothing and tools with a fine scanner. They'd have to get dirty, and getting dirty wasn't their preference. They sold dirty to others. Still, she admired the layered defense and the superficial thoroughness. It never occurred to them that anyone would get so close. If all went well, then Vin and her organization would never know that someone had. Alana walked in and passed another guard. Two, in fact, were waiting by the door. One was clearly a member of Vin's organization, the other one painted as a different kind of professional. Tight black shirt, blue denims, combat boots, not so cleverly hidden beneath. He looked like a soldier that was out of uniform, playing at being subtle. But he wasn't subtle, not to the trained eye. At the bedroom door was another soldier not soldier alongside another of Vin's people. Alana could not believe her luck. Negotiations were happening right now. And if you wanted to read the rest of this, obviously, pick up The Language of Skeptics.